find out it's at 9. I'm so glad you're in my life, forgetting things and making errors.
Thank you.
Well, she gives me
Thank you. I do. That's my aim in life, right?
Remind me that I'm here.
Yeah. Okay, we'll do afterwards. And well, I'll just drive you here.
Okay.
Is there a railing?
Yes. We'll look it over. It's not a thing.
To the stage, Tony Stewart.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to kick off the 36th annual North Idaho College Popcorn Forum and Convocation Series. We have a wonderful week planned for you, and we hope you will be here all week. And first of all, let me say thanks to Shelley Phillips. What a beautiful voice she has. Let's thank her one more time, please. I was speaking to some wonderful people in the audience this morning, and they thanked me for returning to the Chautauqua format. And we did it for 7 years, and for the last 3 years we've done something else, and we're back to that format. Our scholars and our participants have worked for many, many months to prepare for you, and I hope you will be here all week to show them your gratitude. It is one of the most effective ways to learn is through this format. You really retain it. There are two people that represent a very, very important part of what we do. The president of our college, who's always been so supportive, and then the president of the Student Association of Government, and they have been actually co-sponsoring financially this forum for 36 years. Without them, it would not have been possible to have the extent that we have had. To come to the podium to open up the 36th Annual Popcorn Forum, please welcome the President of North Idaho College, Dr. Michael Burke.
Thank you, Tony. Good morning. I've been waiting all semester for today, ever since I saw the program announcing our 36th Annual Popcorn Forum and Convocation Series Symposium. On behalf of everyone who works here, I welcome all of you to the Popcorn Forum this year. I think it bears repeating. This is our 36th Annual Popcorn Forum. I don't think I know of another community college in North America that can tout that kind of record of a commitment to the intellectual life of our country. It's an enormous accomplishment. We somehow managed to do it year in and year out, and I think it speaks highly of us as a community of scholars and teachers and learners. For those of you who this is your first experience with our Popcorn Forum, I have some advice for you. Please buckle your seatbelts, put your tray in the upright and locked position. You're about to go on a very exciting and challenging intellectual ride. You're about to meet an unparalleled cast of speakers this week. They are committed to addressing very important issues, very complex, sometimes controversial issues, as part of our intellectual history as a country. You're going to meet a lot of experts, starting with Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. You're going to meet anti-slavery advocate Frederick Douglass, our founding fathers Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, author Herman Melville, Sigmund Freud even, as well as Niccolo Machiavelli and Catherine de' Medici. Later in the week, we have Dolores Huerta of the United Farm Workers of America, and just for fun, we have Galileo and Winston Churchill. Just to mention a few, an enormous cast of some of the intellectual bright lights of our culture. We have an embarrassment of riches here this week, and you're going to meet dozens of great speakers that represent the great ideas, I think, of our Western civilization. I'd like to give some credit to the founding folks who thought this idea up 36 years ago. Those are very complex times in our nation's history, and the founders of this symposium chose the format you'll see this week of impassioned discourse. Impassioned discourse, where divergent ideas are debated and expressed and investigated over a number of days. And that kind of discourse is really at the heart and soul of what we do as a college. It's the heart and soul, I think, of the intellectual experience here for students. And I hope you leave this week as enriched as possible from the experience of all these wonderful, wonderful speakers. I'd like to take a presidential liberty, Tony, and thank some folks, starting with you. Tony has put enormous amount of effort into making this happen yet again. Tony, congratulations, you've pulled it off. Also want to thank, Tony doesn't do this alone. He does a lot of the heavy lifting, but Karen Tennyson in his office, I saw Karen earlier. Karen, thank you very much for making this happen. There is a Popcorn Forum committee. Dozens of folks have worked all year on this. I want to thank ASNIC for continuing, the Associated Students of North Idaho College, for continuing to support our efforts here. There you go. Someone you may not think of immediately, but our NIC music department is working hard to put on a number of concerts. I hope you get a chance to see Terry Jones and the Duke Ellington Experience on Friday. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah. Give it up for Terry. Our NIC theater department makes this place happen and makes all the lights and sounds work throughout the week. And the NIC video production department back here in the back, see Juice working there. Going to save all this for posterity. Thanks for being here, Juice. And all the other countless hundreds of volunteers on our faculty and staff and students, frankly, who show up and make this happen. They give freely of their time, and I sincerely appreciate it. Together, this team makes this week possible, and we are in your debt. And let me conclude by saying welcome. I'm glad you're here. And it's my pleasure to introduce our extraordinary student body president, Mr. Josh Gittle. Mr. President.
I don't know about extraordinary, but I do my best. Good morning, everyone. I'd just like to say welcome to the 36th Annual Popcorn Forum. The Associated Students of North Idaho College are proud to be a sponsor of this every year to bring such a great educational opportunity to the community and to the students of NIC. On behalf of the students of North Idaho College, I'd just like to say welcome to our beautiful campus by the lake, and it's a great spring day today. Thank you for coming out today and making this event what it is. It's the community and the participants and all the volunteers that really make it what it is. I'd just like to say thank you to Tony Stewart, to the Popcorn Forum Committee, all the volunteers, all the speakers, the moderators, for making this what it is. Without them, we wouldn't have this event. And they really do put in so much time to bring this to everyone. I hope everyone enjoys their stay at North Idaho College today. They have a lot of great speakers covering a lot of different topics. And so for the next couple of days, enjoy your stay here at North Idaho College. And thank you again for coming to the Popcorn Forum. Thanks.
Now, before we begin, we ask that you please silence all cell phones and pagers and watches, please. Thank you. And now, ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome, born 1930, former U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor.
Thank you. Members of the Popcorn Forum Committee, students, faculty, and friends of North Idaho College, it is a great pleasure to be with you today. Now, normally, when I am asked to come to a speaking engagement such as this, I am asked to speak about how I came to be the first woman to wear the robe of the Supreme Court Justice. This morning, I will share with you some of my own personal experiences, and I hope also to leave with you some thoughts on issues that are important: public service, freedom of the press, basic rights of all human beings, and the necessity of an independent judiciary. Now, it occurred to me as I was preparing for this morning that this would be the last time you would see me in this attire. It also occurred to me that much of what I would like to share with you today has much to do with just how I came to wear such honorable apparel and how much this experience has meant to me. You know, I grew up in a very different environment than most of you. on a 198,000-acre ranch, 2,000 cattle, ranch hands, and a 35-mile drive to the nearest town. It was in this environment that I came to know my core values of responsibility, self-reliance, and independence. It was there that I learned to love the outdoors, whether it was riding horses, fixing fences, firing my own rifle, or branding cattle. And it was there that I learned to be a survivor. But there's a real trauma to living in an isolated ranch, and that is the problem of education. The Lazy Bee Ranch was where I learned many things, but it was not where I could get a formal education. Since my grandmother lived in El Paso, where I was born, I was sent there at the age of 6 to attend the Radford School for Girls, traveling home to the ranch for summers and holidays. Living with my grandmother during the school year was an excellent experience for me because she was a strong and an independent woman who told me constantly that I could do anything and be anybody I chose. I grew up listening to that, and I suppose I believed it. At Radford, I worked hard, just as I had on the ranch. I was competitive, I loved sports, and I read prolifically. But I missed my family and my horses. The sacrifice I made and the sacrifice my family made provided for me a formal education that reared me for intellectual independence. And I found myself periodically at odds with my father and the ranch hands. I learned quickly when to stop talking, but I didn't stop thinking, and I soon was prepared for college. I attended Stanford University when I was 16, where I studied economics. When I think back on that amazing time in my life, I think of just how influential my college professors were on who I was to become. There was one, Professor Rathbun, an economics professor, who was probably my biggest influence in college. It was from him that I learned just how important community was. That is not something you learn on an isolated ranch or in a girls' school far from home. Dr. Rathbun taught me that an individual had a responsibility to the community. I had never heard that before. He wanted to persuade us to go out into the world and to do something to better it. And he believed that we could do it. We could do anything. Because of that professor, I chose to go to law school. I went to law school in the 1940s at the age of 19, when most women were still in the home. I was so much more confident by that time. I was never afraid to ask questions, and I wanted to learn everything. You might not know this, but one of my fellow students at Stanford Law School was Justice Rehnquist. Law school is also where I met my husband, John O'Connor. I still warn students today to be aware of proofreading legal briefs over a glass of beer, because it can result in unexpected alliances. I suppose the storybook ending to this is that we would graduate in the top 10% of our class, get married, and go on to have successful professional careers. And that is what happened. But you need to know that I interviewed with several firms after I graduated from Stanford Law School. And I was only offered one position, that of a legal secretary. I declined that. After school, John was drafted into the Army, and we moved to Germany, where I finally worked as an attorney. I also became a pretty darn good snow skier. And after the military, we chose to settle in Phoenix. John and I felt that by living in Phoenix, we would have a better opportunity to serve our community and be more actively involved than had we gone back to California. I passed the bar exam in Arizona and was sworn in 3 days before the birth of my first son, Scott. Over the years, 2 decades in Phoenix, I would have 2 more sons, in addition to running a small legal firm, campaigning on behalf of Republican candidates, sitting on several political committees, serving as trustee of the Federal Bankruptcy Court, and eventually Assistant Attorney General, U.S. Senator, Chair of the Legislative Committee, and eventually the House Majority Leader. So when people ask me about being the first woman to sit on the Supreme Court, I tell them I have been fortunate to have many firsts as a woman, and that prepared me for the responsibility. I was also lucky enough to marry a man who had an appreciation for my independence and ambition. In fact, he was even willing to sacrifice some of his drive for mine. Believe me, it helps to marry someone with the understanding and expectation of both partners that the wife intends to pursue her career. And in this way, John was never disappointed by the greater share of responsibility with the children. In the 1970s, Nixon had nominated a number of new judges to the Supreme Court. I, like many women of my time, was ready for a female in that role, and I wrote him a note to tell him that. Eventually, he nominated Justice Rehnquist, and I supported that decision, but I was slightly saddened by the fact that none of his nominees wore a skirt. I remember seeing a cartoon in the Arizona Republic with a picture of a man standing next to a nurse looking into the window of a nursery. The caption below read, "Just think, someday she may become a Supreme Court justice." Well, I clipped that out and I sent that to Justice Rehnquist. But it was not until nearly a decade later that Ronald Reagan stated during his campaign that he was willing to put a woman on the bench. By that time, the nation seemed more ready to do the same. I had some suggestions for him, and I wrote him. So you can imagine my surprise and my delight when I was visited at my ranch by some of his aides. Here I was, in an insignificant state, an appeals court judge, relatively unknown, and I was actually being considered for the position of the first female Supreme Court justice. Well, I suppose the rest is history. I was nominated and confirmed. It was a huge responsibility, but I was ready. Now, let me tell you just a little about what my position has entailed over the last 25 years. As you know, we have state courts and we have federal courts. The federal courts are split up into 13 circuits. I have been positioned in management over the 9th Circuit, which is actually the largest, the western United States, Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands. Some of my daily responsibilities have to do with that. But I wanted to tell you about what it's like to sit on the Supreme Court bench. Now, I don't know, many of you may have visited the Supreme Court, but let me explain some of the details. Over the space of a year, we as justices will deal with somewhere between 100 and 150 cases. Which cases we choose are left completely up to our discretion. Any of the 9 justices can suggest to the others that we take a case and review it, but there are hundreds that we refuse. There are a number of questions that we ask when we review a case. Will this issue arise again? Are all other courts in agreement? Is it a pressing issue? Is it one that continually crops up across the country? Has the finding been lopsided between the circuit courts? If at least 4 of the 9 justices decide that it is a case worthy of taking, we take it. At that point, our clerk schedules an oral argument and requests a written brief from the parties. The written briefs help us with the history in understanding what the case is about. We do our research with the help of our legal clerks, and we prepare for oral arguments. Now, oral arguments are short. They're timed to no longer than 1 hour. In fact, there's a podium much like this in front of the bench with a yellow light and a red light. The yellow light goes off to let the speaker know they have 5 minutes left. The red light lets them know time's out. We always joke that there should be a trap door there. After reading the written briefs and listening to the oral arguments, the justices begin to ask questions. The question-answer period can be quite long. We have several law professors on the bench. They enjoy asking questions. Finally, we meet in conference. Conference is perhaps the most fascinating aspect of our job. It is private. There's no staff. And that's when we go over the merits of the case. It's where we cast our vote. It's where we confirm or reverse a decision. And it's where we write our full opinions. The opinion is perhaps the most interesting part of the job. The opinion draft is assigned by the Chief Justice, who makes a writing assignment to one justice on the majority side and one justice on the minority side. You see, in the end, we must have a reason for confirming and a reason for reversing a decision. Once the drafts are completed, they're circulated among the justices for editing and changes. Dissent is always written by the most senior justice on the minority side. Finally, the confirmation or the dissenting decision and the result of our vote is made public. I wanted to share that with you because that's the process that goes on behind doors. Now, there is no how to be a justice manual out there. In addition to the absolute dedication to the Constitution, there are a lot of unwritten traditions that have served us for over 190 years. When you come in as an associate justice, as I did, you have to watch and learn. And I stepped on many toes when I first got there. Now I know, after 25 years. I suppose most of what I have done this far is share my experience, but it was important to me today that I share with you also some thoughts on important issues. Considering I'm speaking to a community college, I wanted to emphasize how I feel about community. I believe it is important to emphasize just how great the work of public service is. I did not grow up wanting to be a Supreme Court justice. I grew up wanting to run a ranch. And when I realized that I was going into public service, I spent my life with a drive toward bettering the community in which I lived. My community at a time was Phoenix. And then my community became Arizona. My community then became the United States of America, and now my community is global. This is where we can do the best work. I also want to leave you with some thoughts that I consider to be the 3 most important elements of a democratic society. These are changing times. My experience has taught me much, and I have grown through that experience. But there are 3 principles to which I have always and will always hold fast. The logic that guided our founders to establish certain safeguards within our system, and the experience that we have had over the last 200 years provide an example from which other nations can learn. During my tenure, I have witnessed great change in the Soviet Union, Central and South America, and now the Middle East. The chaos that can arise from fallen states must be mended by the rule of law. Having said that, the need for these 3 elements is essential to the repair of a fallen state, the continuation of democracy. And it's important to note that these three transcend state and national borders. They are the independent judiciary, a free press, and the principle that certain basic rights to which every citizen is entitled must be placed outside of the reach of political exigency. Now let me address each of them individually because they are very important, and this is what you need to leave with today. First, an independent judiciary. Remember, the framers of the Constitution intended that the Supreme Court be appointed and provided to ensure good behavior. To do that, they must enjoy tenure and independence. The judiciary must be free from potential domination of other parts of the government. It is essential that the members of the judiciary be even-handed, be consistent, be objective, and be incorruptible. Safeguards for both the position and the compensation of the judges is essential, because unless both are protected, the safeguard is empty. At times, the judiciary must be prepared to show courage, to go against the popular vote, like they did in Brown versus Board of Education. And at times, the judiciary must go against the personal preference of the president who nominated them or the Senate who confirmed them. Regardless of the party that nominated them, once confirmed, judges are not there to determine or advance public policy on the basis of personal preference or the preference of those who put them there. It is a great misfortune to have other people or the media portray the court as sitting up there trying to make policy choices. If it is a constitutional issue, we start with the terms of the Constitution, and we have over 200 years of precedent that we must acknowledge and respect. Under no circumstances are we sitting there saying, gee, what is good for America? That is just not the way the system works. Second, a free press. An independent judiciary is necessary, yes, but certainly not sufficient to the maintenance of a free society. A judiciary that stands apart from the other branches of government is able to perform its function without fear of sanction. Likewise, a responsible press, free from government control, is able to perform its function of comment and criticism. Only an independent, vigorous, responsible press permits democratic institutions to correct themselves through the powerful forces of informed debate and public opinion. Our founders recognized the risk that they took in protecting the press. As their experience showed, speech was the tool of change and revolution. For a nation to adapt itself to new ideas and new change, it must permit the unconstrained exchange of opinions. Finally, third, the principle that certain basic rights to which every citizen is entitled must be placed outside the reach of political control. That is the purpose of the Bill of Rights. It has permitted us to place the most essential individual liberties beyond the reach of the majority, and to guard the individual against the excesses of the collective government. As James Madison, who framed its ultimate shape, told the Congress, the Bill of Rights was directed sometimes against the abuse of the executive power, sometimes against the abuse of the legislative power, and in some cases against the community itself. Or, in other words, against the majority in favor of the minority. Now, this points out a tension within the concept of democracy. Yes, democracy is the free will of the people. But our democratic system includes a mechanism to protect a range of civil and human rights to ensure that the will of the majority does not run roughshod over the rights of the minority. Should this mechanism not be in place, all citizens must live in fear that they will one day find themselves the minority and fall prey to the fears and passions of the political majority. Some might ask how the United States can put so much emphasis on the will of the people in our democratic system and yet permit unelected, unaccountable judges to countermand the will of the representative, executive, and the legislative branches. The debate over the counter-majoritarian courts and judicial activism is familiar to us as our system recognizes that the will of the people is the best law. It also acknowledges that there can be no liberty where the majority is free to tyrannize over the minority. Citizens turn to judges who are empowered to invalidate the laws that encroach on protected rights. The courts at times may act contrary to the will of the majority, but in so doing, they further the principles of the system by ensuring that all groups, including outsiders and minorities, enjoy certain baseline protections. Of course, the fact that the judiciary is the source of the protection for the most essential rights only intensifies the need for an independent judiciary, where judges have authority to strike down the action of the other branches, the way in which the judges are chosen, and the conditions under which they perform their function are of the utmost importance. And so, in the end, the bedrock, these three principles are independent judiciary, a free press, and a mechanism for guaranteeing basic rights to all. These principles work together. These three principles were put in place by our founders 200 years ago to guard against the evils that haunt every political system. And at the foundation of these principles is the law. I like to say we must not be tone deaf to the music of the law. There are lawyers and lay people who never hear the music of the law. Indeed, those who think there is none. Those who think the law is just a business, one for which high fees can be charged and collected for the necessary services only a lawyer can provide. But if you understand and hear the law's music, to quote from a former law school classmate of mine, it is the music filled with the logic and the clarity of Bach, the thunder, sometimes overblown and pompous, of Wagner, the lyric passion of Verdi and Puccini, the genius of Mozart, Gershwin's invention, Rossini and Vivaldi's energy, Aaron Copland's folksy common sense, Beethoven's majesty, and unfortunately, not a little of the ponderous tedium of Mahler and the sterile intellectualism of Schoenberg. The words of the music of the law you can hear are words of equality, justice, fairness, consistency, predictability, equity, wrongs righted, and the purpose of disputes settled without violence, without undue advantage, and without leaving either side with bitter feelings of having been cheated. It is the music sung in the world of childlike innocence, in which the lion lays down with the lamb. Perhaps it is not a world that ever was, nor ever will be, but it is a world worth living toward. Thank you.
That is what Chautauqua is. Wasn't she brilliant? Just brilliant. The justice has agreed to answer some questions, and it'll be like this all week. But before we have the questions, be sure to come at 1 o'clock to the Student Union upstairs. We'll have other performers there. I will bring the mic around, so ask the distinguished justice some questions. Just an incredibly moving presentation. Who would like to be first? We need to get this on the mic for the television. So.
As a justice, perhaps you could comment on which decision you are not in agreement with that you would have the power to reverse during your period on the court that has not already been reversed. Thank you.
There are so many. No, I can't. I can't think of just one. I can tell you that when the justices make their decision, that they do it out of sound mind. And that even though we come out with a vote, often 5-4, that there is a level of respect that is offered to either side, that we trust one another. Now, there can be contention at times, I would say, but it always levels itself out. No, I can't come up with one.
You certainly, you were very involved in a lot of 5-4 decisions when you decided to vote.
Yes.
One of those that you, this mic on? The mic's on dead. Can you get it going? I think we got some bad batteries this morning where it came from. I think if you hear me, you were very upset when your last dissenting opinion was dealing with property rights. When you lost the fight for that property taken for even building nice condos away from home because the tax rate will be higher. Maybe you'll talk about that.
Right. I think that a lot of my perception on property rights comes from growing up in a rural environment and watching the amount of responsibility that it takes to control a piece of land and what it's like for people when land is taken away. But yes, I do. I struggle constantly when there's something I feel very strongly about, but I also have to use a very objective mind so I can see the other side.
Thank you. Next question.
Much importance is given to precedent. How do you approach, from an intellectual standpoint, reviewing precedent and how it applies or not applies to the present time?
It's a very good question. The precedent is of utmost importance, of course, but you find that the culture of the court changes over time, very subtly and very slowly. And it's never that the words of the Constitution change, it's that the interpretation of those words change. And what has happened during my tenure is that we have read the words of the Constitution and interpreted them to be slightly different than those who have come before us have done. I think a good example of that has to do with the idea of equality. There was a sense that equality at one time was interpreted of that between men. Later, justices interpreted it to include women, and we have now, of course, more of a grander scale of interpretation that will include minorities. And so over time, very slowly, the interpretation of the words themselves change. But the precedent that has been set before gauges how we are to start the reading. Who we are and how we interpret the words gauges how that interpretation changes.
It appears to me that the court goes out of its way on some decisions to make a very narrow technical decision rather than looking at the broader constitutional issues. And I would probably say that, to me, in the separation of church and state is in one of those areas. Now, if you agree that's the case, you would say so, yes or no. But then beyond that, if you agree with it, how can you justify the court avoiding taking the broader constitutional view?
An example that comes to mind when you bring that up, when you say the separation between church and state, is a decision that I had made also years ago in looking at what I felt was most reasonable. It had to do with the idea of the Ten Commandments being placed on the front of a building. And we had gone through the wording of the Constitution. We have to be very meticulous, and I think the personalities of the judges really comes into play there, because some are going to be more meticulous with the technical wording than others. But often we have to step back and we have to ask ourselves how we feel the most reasonable individual would feel about something. And often that is a way that I interpret or make a decision.
Other questions?
Let's break out our questions, Tony.
Being the first female on the Supreme Court, how was that taken on both a personal level with the other justices you work with and on a public level as well? Do you feel like people were ready to accept a female into a profession that had not previously accepted that?
That's a good question. I was prepared for the position. I went into the job ready to use the legal background that I had, just like I would any job. I was thrown out onto a stage, in a sense, a public figure with a huge amount of responsibility as the first woman of the court. And here I was simply trying to do the job that all justices had done before me. And so I had to very quickly get used to the amount of attention, the press and the interviews and so forth. But I also fully realized the responsibility that I had to other women. Like I said, though, I had had many positions in my past where I had been the first woman before, so that was nothing new to me. What was new to me was being on the national stage, and that took some getting used to. But I can tell you that I do believe that the justices treated me wonderfully, very fairly. They were enthusiastic about having a woman on the bench. And I felt that I knew that the statistics were, there were about 89% of the country were in favor of having a woman. So I knew there were statistically people out there who were not interested in having a woman, but I did not experience as much of a backlash from that small percentage as I did encouragement from the larger percentage.
We will have one more question, and then she'll go out of character. We always have to go out of character and talk about the experience. Bonnie, you have the last question.
How do you feel about issues, like Brown versus the Board of Education and Roe versus Wade were major social issues that changed America? Do you feel that these will ever be eroded?
Voted on again.
Overturned, yes.
Overturned. I think that they can come up for discussion again. It is very unlikely to me that there would be a momentous overturning unless a change starts to happen slowly. One of the things that I've realized over 25 years is that change does happen very slowly in the court. And so there may be discussion for years, but it would have to be yeah, I would think it would be rather drastic for it to change.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Sharla Chittick.
Good. I was going to whip off my wig, but I think I have so many bobby pins in it I can't get it off my head. I want to apologize to you. I could not answer that question. I spent so much time looking at her 5-4 where she was the fifth vote. I didn't even think to go back and look at the 5-4 where she was the 4 vote and had lost. And I was just totally panicking when you asked that question. I'm sorry. Now I'm going to go research it. I'm going to run and go research it and find out. I want to thank everybody for coming today. This was really tough. I've done this twice before. I did Susan B. Anthony a few years ago, and before that, Joan of Arc. And both of them are long gone. And it's a lot easier to get a hold of material on someone who's long gone and to learn about them and to feel like you know them than to capture someone, especially like Sandra Day O'Connor, who is still alive, still doing her thing. And she would not have worn a robe, but I wanted to give you this visual that would stick in your head. She would have worn a very nice formal suit. And I can't afford that, so. But there are little things that I did. I just never felt like I could do her total justice. Yeah, Bonnie. No, she hasn't. But you know what? I could not believe how much I came across. She's such an avid fisherwoman. That, she just took a trip to Mongolia, and they said, Mongolia? And she said, yeah, the fly fishing is great. I thought, yeah. Any other questions yeah. No, and this is the first time I've done it. And what I did, at first I thought, okay, I want to do kind of a biography of her, and then I want to get into, really the guts of who she is. And I found it so hard. I ended up actually kind of piecing together pieces of speeches. And her book, she's written 2 books actually, and then there's one by Joan Biskupik, I think is how you say it, who covers the Supreme Court justices, who wrote a book on her. And so those were my 3 books. And then her 3 principles, she wrote a small book with an intro by, I thought this is interesting, Kenneth Starr did the intro to that book. And so her 3 principles I thought would be really important, but it was kind of this mishmash of all of these bits and pieces. And I don't know how she'd feel about tugging, because some of it was things she said years ago, and some of it is things she said last summer. So it was kind of this jigsaw puzzle that I had to put together.
We're going to have to let Sharla get some rest. This is very exhausting to do, and they worked for months and months getting ready for this. But Sharla Chittick teaches history here, and she's...
ancient history.
She's one of our very, very favorite faculty. The students love her, and when she did Joan of Arc, she started in French, and the audience thought she was going to speak the whole time in French, and she is bilingual, and she does a lot of traveling. She's a wonderful, wonderful friend, and the hours they put in is just unbelievable to make this so special. And I will tell you that you'll find many more. I hope you'll come at 1 o'clock today over at the top of the floor to Lake Coeur d'Alene Room, and we'll have a 90-minute program. You'll get about 40 minutes to ask questions. I just want you to know that in the others that are coming forth, all of those main characters have now passed away some years ago, and you'll feel like you've gone back in time and really talked to someone. That's how good they are, that you've talked to someone who lived at a very different time. One quick story, the gentleman on Friday that does Galileo has been here before, and it was a wonderful time when he was here. A lady came up after he had left and said to me she was a wonderful person. She said, I'm really upset with Mr. Galileo. He was not correct in some of his interpretations, and I have an article for him. And so I couldn't wait to mail it to Mr. Fred Krebs. I said, Mr. Galileo, there's a woman that's really upset with you in Coeur d'Alene. He said, bless her heart, I've been dead for hundreds of years. So we really get into the characters, and that is wonderful. So thank you so much for being here, and Sharla, thank you again.
Thank you for coming.